March 24, 1945. To 30 hours. The Rhine River near Wessel. A cold, pre-dawn mist clings to the black water of the Rhine. On the eastern bank, in a dugout observation post, a German sentry scans the opposite shore through his Sherman Fernross's periscope. His world is defined by this mighty river the Rhine, the ancient barrier, Germany's last great natural fortress. His orders are clear. Watch for bridges, watch for boats, watch for the telltale sounds of pontoon assembly. The silence is broken only by the lap of water and distant artillery thunder to the south. Then, a new sound, a low, guttural churning, like a swarm of mechanical beetles. He adjusts the scope. Nothing. No silhouettes of landing craft, no outlines of bridging equipment. The sound grows, and then he sees them. Dark shapes, low in the water, emerging from the mist. Not boats. They are too low, too wide. As a stray flare drifts down, its magnesium light reflects not on water, but on green-painted steel and the long, sinister barrel of a 75mm gun. Tanks. Sherman tanks swimming, moving implacably across the river's current without a bridge in sight. In that frozen moment, tactical understanding shatters. The rules of warfare have just been rewritten. The problem was as old as warfare itself, the river. By 1944, the Allied armies, having broken out of Normandy, were driving east across France and Belgium at a staggering pace. Their momentum was fueled by mechanical might columns of tanks, trucks, and artillery that stretched for miles. But this very strength contained a critical vulnerability. Every waterway, from the narrow Seine to the broad Maas, acted as a sudden brake on the advance. Bridges were inevitably destroyed by retreating German forces. Each halt to assemble a pontoon bridge or organize an assault crossing gave the shattered but resilient German defenders precious days to dig in, reinforce, and prepare a new defensive line on the opposite bank. The tactical calculus was brutally simple. A river crossing was a moment of extreme peril. Infantry could be ferried across in vulnerable boats, but they would arrive on the hostile shore without heavy support, facing fortified positions and armored counterattacks. Traditional tanks, the spearhead of the Allied blitzkrieg, were helpless until a bridge was secured, an engineering task that could take hours. Under devastating fire, this sequential process: secure a bridgehead with infantry, then build a bridge, then bring tanks across, was a recipe for costly stalemate. The Germans, masters of defensive warfare, had become adept at turning these river lines into killing zones. They knew the Allies had to either find a bridge, build one, or bottle themselves up on the water's edge. The solution, therefore, had to defy this logic. What if the tanks didn't need the bridge? What if they could support the infantry from the moment they landed, arriving with them in the first wave? This was the genesis of a seemingly absurd idea: an amphibious battle tank. The challenge was immense. A standard 30-ton Sherman tank was a steel brick. To make it swim required not just buoyancy, but stability, propulsion, and protection, all without compromising its function as a fighting vehicle the moment its tracks touched ground. It was a puzzle that would consume engineers, demand extraordinary courage from its crews, and ultimately deliver one of the most profound tactical surprises of the war. The quest to solve this puzzle began not on the battlefields of Europe, but in the mind of a Hungarian-born engineer in a British workshop. The man with the solution was Nicholas Straussler, a brilliant and pragmatic engineer. His concept was elegant in its simplicity, yet audacious in execution. Instead of redesigning the entire tank, he created a portable, deployable flotation system. The core of the Duplex Drive, DD, was a watertight canvas screen supported by a collapsible frame of rubberized tubes and steel struts. When raised, this screen gave the tank enough buoyancy to float. When lowered, it vanished, leaving the tank fully combat-ready. Propulsion came from twin propellers mounted at the rear, driven by power takeoffs from the tank's own engine, hence Duplex Drive, allowing it to drive on tracks or screws. The commander, standing exposed in the turret, would steer using a simple tiller. It was a masterpiece of mechanical adaptation, turning a land weapon into a naval vessel in under 30 minutes. The British War Office, intrigued but skeptical, allocated worn-out Valentine tanks for testing. The trials in 1940–43, conducted in the rough waters of the Firth of Forth and off the coast of Scotland, were perilous. Tanks swamped, screens collapsed, and crews were lucky to escape. But the concept proved viable. With the invasion of Normandy, Operation Overlord on the horizon, the need for such a weapon became urgent. The Allies identified 5 assault beaches. 2, Utah and Omaha, were assigned to the Americans. The other 3, Gold, Juno, and Sword, were British and Canadian objectives. Intelligence suggested all were protected by obstacles, mines, and fortified positions. Getting armor onto the beaches in the first critical minutes was deemed essential to suppress enemy fire and support the vulnerable infantry. The Sherman DD was selected for this near-suicidal task. Production shifted to the more abundant and powerful M for Sherman. The design was refined, the screen was strengthened, bilge pumps added, and the propellers made more reliable. The crews, drawn from armoured regiments like the British 13th, 18th Royal Hussars and the Canadian 1st Hussars, underwent relentless training. They practiced launching from landing craft, swimming in formations, and drying out on beaches, all under strict secrecy. The project was classified at the highest level, its very existence a closely guarded weapon in itself. The Germans, aware of the threat of invasion, had fortified the coast, but their defensive calculus, like that of the sentry on the Rhine later, was rooted in conventional wisdom. They prepared for boats and bridges, they were not prepared for swimming tanks. By June 5, 1944, hundreds of these modified Shermans, their canvas screens lying folded like shrouds over their hulls, were loaded onto specialized landing craft, tank LCTs in English ports. Their crews, briefed on their monumental objective, faced a channel crossing in vessels that were little more than floating bathtubs. The stage was set for the DD's first great, bloody test that would ultimately pave the way for the shock, yet to come on the banks of the Rhine. In a cluttered British workshop, far from the sound of guns, the war was being reimagined. Nicholas Straussler's DD system was a work of profound ingenuity born of necessity. It represented a paradigm shift not in the tank's armor or firepower, but in its fundamental mobility. The genius was in its impermanence. The 36-ton Sherman didn't become a boat, it temporarily wore one. The canvas and rubber screen, when inflated, displaced just enough water to keep the steel hulk barely afloat, its hull sitting less than a meter above the waterline. The propellers, linked directly to the tank's engine, could push it through calm water at a modest 4 knots. Straussler understood the psychological as much as the mechanical problem. For the defender, a tank was a terrestrial terror. Its sudden appearance from the aqueous realm, shedding its watery skin to become a land predator again, was designed to confound and destabilize. Yet, the engineer's elegant solution created a soldier's nightmare. The system was fragile. A single shell fragment, a piece of shrapnel, or rough seas could puncture the screen, turning the tank into a steel coffin in seconds. Straussler's vision was a breathtaking gamble, trading the tank as armor protection for the element of supreme surprise. For the 4-man crew inside a Sherman DD, the experience was one of unique and concentrated terror. They referred to themselves with dark humor as sailors in a canvas canoe. During the swim, the commander stood exposed in the turret hatch, drenched and vulnerable, steering with his tiller and praying for calm water. Below him, the driver peered through a tiny, water-blurred periscope, the engine roaring in the confined space. The gunner and loader could do nothing but wait, listening to the slosh of water against the thin hull, knowing that their lives depended entirely on a rubberized canvas skirt and to small bilge pumps. All hatches, except the commander's, were battened down. A successful landing required perfect sequencing. The driver must find traction on the riverbed or beach. The commander must give the order, and the crew inside must manually collapse the screen. Until that moment, they were not tankers, they were men entombed in a slow, sinking box, utterly defenseless. The courage required to climb into that machine, launch into open water under fire, and advance toward a hostile shore was of a particular, quiet kind. They were riding a secret that could drown them long before the enemy ever got a chance to kill them. For the German soldier, especially the veteran of the Eastern Front or the Italian campaign, warfare had a brutal logic. Rivers were pauses. They were moments to regroup, to dig in on the high ground, to sight artillery and machine guns on the likely crossing points. His tactical manuals had taught him what to expect at a river crossing: the clatter of engineers, the silhouettes of assault boats, the chaos of bridges under construction. A swimming tank did not merely introduce a new weapon, it shattered the logic of the battlefield itself. The shock was immediate and cognitive. If tanks could now swim, then the river, long relied upon as an obstacle, had become meaningless. Defensive plans unraveled in seconds. Heavy armor, which should have been absent for hours, was suddenly present, emerging from the water, climbing the banks and leading the assault. This moment of disbelief often translated into paralysis, panic, and abandoned strongpoints. The DD tank was more than machinery. It was a psychological weapon designed to collapse the enemy's understanding of how war at a river was supposed to work. The power of the DD tank depended entirely on secrecy. Security around the program was obsessive. Training took place in remote bays. Screens were never erected near civilians, and the very existence of the units was tightly controlled. This secrecy enabled a decisive strategic deception in the spring of 1945. As Allied armies closed on the Rhine, German commanders knew a crossing was inevitable. They expected a massive, conventional assault at obvious bottlenecks like the Remagen bridgehead captured intact, but dangerously congested. Allied planners deliberately encouraged this belief, staging visible preparations for bridge-heavy crossings and drawing German attention and reserves. Meanwhile, DD-equipped units slipped quietly toward less guarded stretches of river. The objective was not a single tactical surprise, but an operational shock that would ripple across the entire German defensive line. When the swimming tanks finally appeared, they represented the culmination of more than 2 years of concealment. Their emergence was not merely physical, but psychological, the release of a secret. At the precise moment it would cause maximum disbelief. The dripping hulls breaching the Rhine were the payoff for countless acts of discipline and silence. The visible proof that the intelligence war had been won before the first shot was fired. March 23 to 24, 1945. Along the western bank of the Rhine near Oppenheim and Wessel, Operation Plunder begins not with thunder but with near silence. Under a moonless sky, tank crews move through the darkness, performing a final ritual. Clamps are unlocked, compressed air bottles opened, and rubber tubes hiss as tall canvas screens rise around their Shermans. The tanks transform into strange floating shapes, half-hidden pagodas of steel and fabric. These are the spearheads of the US, 9th Army and the British 2nd Army. One by one, the tanks crawl down prepared ramps and slip into the Rhine. The current is swift and cold, nearly 7 knots with spring melt. Propellers churn black water as the tanks move low in the river, only their screens and turrets visible. To a distant eye, they might resemble slow barges, but there are no eyes watching. German patrols are focused downstream, where diversionary artillery batters the obvious crossing sites. Near Oppenheim and Wessel, the night remains eerily quiet, broken only by distant thunder. Tank commanders stand exposed in their hatches, gripping tillers, fighting the current to hold formation. Inside the hulls, drivers stare through periscopes, navigating by compass and pre-planned bearings. Once the screens are raised, there is no retreat. They cannot be lowered in deep water. The tanks are committed. The plan is brutally simple: land en masse on lightly defended banks, dry out, shed the screens, and form an armored fist before the enemy can respond. For nearly an hour, the tanks drift and motor across the Rhine in complete isolation. The tension is not of imminent combat, but of vulnerability. 30-ton machines floating in darkness, utterly dependent on canvas and air. Then comes the most welcome sound any crew could imagine: gravel grinding against steel. The hulls scrape the riverbed, dry out, drivers gun engines, tracks bite into submerged earth, and water and mud churn as the tanks climb the shallow incline. At the water's edge, the transformation is instantaneous. Levers are pulled, screens collapse and deflate, rubber tubes slacken, and the strange aquatic vessels vanish. In under a minute, battle-ready M4 Shermans stand on the eastern bank, water pouring from their flanks, guns already traversing. Headlights flick on, illuminating crude exit paths. The whisper of propellers is replaced by the roar of engines. The psychological weapon sheds its skin and becomes a physical one. German resistance collapses into chaos. A machine gun nest, positioned to cover inland roads, suddenly finds itself firing at tanks emerging from the river itself. Flares burst overhead, casting ghostly light on a nightmare scene, dozens, then hundreds of armored vehicles climbing from the water like primordial creatures. Confused reports flood command posts, panzers, Aus dem Fluss, tanks. From the river, disbelief gives way to panic. Artillery observers scramble to adjust fire, but their guns are aimed at the wrong places. The DD tanks are already dispersing, driving inland, securing the bridgehead with armor instead of fragile infantry. At Oppenheim, elements of the US 9th Armored Division establish a foothold, with stunning speed encountering only scattered resistance. At Wesel, British DD units land in coordination with the massive airborne Operation Varsity, unfolding just inland. The most dangerous phase of a river crossing the vulnerable early hours is neutralized. By the time German reserves, such as Panzerlehr, begin to move, they are not counterattacking exposed infantry, but colliding with established armored spearheads supported by artillery and air power. The Rhine, a barrier trusted for centuries, is breached not through slow engineering, but in a single armored surge. The consequences are immediate and irreversible. German command and control, already strained by retreat and Allied air dominance, fractures under the shock. Defensive plans built around the river collapse instantly. Reserve units waiting for the main Allied thrust discover the enemy already behind their lines. With armored bridgeheads secure, Allied engineers begin their real work unimpeded. Pontoon and Bailey bridges span the Rhine within hours, not days. Through these arteries pour the mass of Allied armies. From Oppenheim, US forces explode eastward. Unlike the accidental, narrow capture of the Ludendorff Bridge at Remagen, these crossings are deliberate and broad. Armored columns surge into open country, meeting resistance that is fragmented and demoralized. The objective is no longer penetration, it is annihilation. Within days, the US 1st and 9th Armies execute a flawless double envelopment of the Ruhr Valley. More than 300,000 German troops of Army Group B are trapped in what becomes the Ruhr Pocket, the largest capitulation on the Western Front. It is a terminal blow to the Wehrmacht's capacity for organized resistance. The psychological impact is profound. A captured German staff officer later admits, "We knew you would cross the Rhine, but we didn't expect you to come like that." The river had been the fatherland's final psychological crutch. Its sudden irrelevance signals, even to the most fanatical defenders, that the war is lost. The swimming tanks become symbols of Allied inevitability, eroding the last remnants of defensive will. Yet the legacy of the DD tank is inseparable from its darker half. The triumph on the Rhine is shadowed by the catastrophe of Normandy. At Omaha Beach, rough seas and a premature launch doomed 27 of 29 DD tanks of the 741st and 743rd Tank Battalions. Many sink with their crews before firing a shot. At Utah Beach, launched closer to shore, they succeed. On British and Canadian beaches, they swim effectively and provide crucial fire support. The contrast defines the DD's nature, a weapon of extreme context, dependent on weather, planning and courage. The human cost was immense. Casualty rates among DD units were among the highest in the armored corps. Crews faced drowning, helpless exposure to enemy fire and brutal combat on land. A British after-action report understated the reality. The behavior of all crews during the swim was excellent, considering the unpleasant nature of the operation. Unpleasant meant terror in darkness, cold water, and a vehicle defying its own nature. Technologically, the DD was a dead end. The future belonged to purpose-built amphibious vehicles, not floating battle tanks. Yet its legacy was not mechanical, but conceptual. It proved the necessity of delivering overwhelming force immediately onto a hostile shore. It showed that obstacles could be turned against defenders who trusted them too completely. For millennia, the Rhine had been border, barrier, and symbol. In 1945, it became the last fortress of a collapsing Reich. The ungainly Sherman DD canvas, rubber, and steel did more than cross a river. It crossed a threshold of expectation. It embodied the triumph of ingenuity over fixed thinking, delivering the weapon the enemy had not imagined, arriving in the way he believed impossible. On that dark water, the war did not end at the Rhine, it ended with its irrelevance.